The clock struck 10:17 a.m. on June 12, 2025, when John G. Fitzgerald Hanson drew his final breath inside the sterile walls of Oklahoma State Penitentiary. After more than 2.5 decades on death row, the 52-year-old man who had terrorized Tulsa County in the summer of 1999 was finally held accountable for crimes that shocked even seasoned investigators. But this story isn't just about an execution. It's about two innocent lives stolen on a sweltering August night, a justice system tested by political interference, and the complex questions that death penalty cases always leave in their wake. To understand how we reach this moment, we must travel back to where it all began. The evening of August 31st, 1999, started like any other for Mary Agnes Bowles. The 77-year-old grandmother had just finished her routine evening stroll through Promenade Mall, a habit that kept her active and connected to the Tulsa community she loved. Mary wasn't just any senior citizen living out her golden years. She was a woman whose compassion had touched countless lives through her volunteer work at St. Francis Hospital, where she had dedicated over 11,000 hours to the neonatal intensive care unit, cradling premature babies and providing comfort to worried families. As Mary walked to her vehicle in the mall's parking lot that Tuesday evening, she had no way of knowing that two predators had been circling the area, hunting for their next victim. John Hanson and his partner in crime, Victor Cornell Miller, had spent the day driving through Tulsa with malicious intent, searching for someone vulnerable, someone they could exploit for their own twisted purposes. When they spotted Mary alone in the dimly lit parking lot, they saw what they thought was an easy target. What they failed to see was a woman who had spent decades caring for others, a pillar of her community whose absence would leave an irreplaceable void. The decision they made in that moment would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to today's execution. Mary was forced from her car at gunpoint, her evening routine transformed into every family's darkest nightmare. The two men drove her to a remote location near Atoka, to a small dirt pit operation owned by 44-year-old Gerald Max Thurman. Gerald was a hard-working entrepreneur who had built his modest business from the ground up, often working late into the evening to keep his operation running smoothly. That fateful night, Gerald was at his property when he noticed an unfamiliar vehicle on his land. Being a responsible business owner, he approached to investigate what he assumed might be trespassers or perhaps someone in need of assistance. It was an act of ordinary courage that would cost him everything. According to testimony presented during the subsequent trials, Miller confronted Gerald and, without warning, opened fire. Multiple gunshots rang out across the isolated property as the business owner fell, critically wounded but still clinging to life. Mary watched the violence unfold from inside the vehicle, her terror mounting as she witnessed the cold-blooded attack on an innocent man. But the night's horrors were far from over. After leaving Gerald mortally wounded, the two men drove a short distance to a secluded ditch area. It was there, according to court records, that John Hanson took Mary's life, firing between 4 and 6 shots, according to the medical examiner's later testimony. The grandmother, who had spent her retirement years nurturing newborn babies, died alone in a ditch, her body abandoned by men who showed no regard for human dignity. The criminals then embarked on what prosecutors would later describe as an armed felony spree. Over the following 5 days, they committed additional robberies throughout the Tulsa area, including targeting a video rental store and a local bank. Each crime was committed at gunpoint, each one demonstrating the same callous disregard for human life that had characterized their initial attacks. Their crime wave might have continued indefinitely, but it came to an abrupt halt when Miller's wife, following a domestic dispute with her husband, contacted law enforcement and provided information that led to both men's capture. When authorities arrested Hanson and Miller just 2 days after Mary's body was discovered, they found 2 individuals who showed little remorse for the destruction they had caused. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of their actions. Mary's remains were found on September 7, 1999, more than a week after her family had reported her missing. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition, making the discovery even more traumatic for the search teams. Gerald Thurman had been discovered earlier by his nephew, who had grown concerned when phone calls to the business went unanswered. Despite emergency medical treatment, Gerald succumbed to his injuries 2 weeks later, never fully able to describe what he had witnessed that night. The evidence against both perpetrators was overwhelming. Forensic analysis, witness statements, and the confession obtained from Miller's wife all supported the prosecution's case. However, as the legal proceedings unfolded, a significant disparity emerged in how justice would be administered. Victor Miller, who had been the triggerman in Gerald Thurman's death, received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. John Hanson, convicted of Mary Bowles's murder, was sentenced to death. This difference in sentences would become a central point of controversy throughout the lengthy appeals process. Hanson's defense attorneys argued that Miller had been the primary aggressor, claiming that their client had been following Miller's lead throughout the crime spree. They even suggested that Miller had later boasted about being the one who actually killed Mary Bowles. But the Tulsa County jury that deliberated Hanson's fate heard extensive testimony about his criminal background, including his federal convictions for armed bank robbery and his escalating pattern of violent behavior. When the jury retired to consider his sentence in 2000, they concluded that death was the appropriate punishment. The judge concurred, and Hanson was formally sentenced to death. However, this would prove to be only the beginning of a legal saga that would span multiple decades and involve the highest levels of the American government. Hanson's first reprieve came in 2006 when the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a new sentencing hearing due to procedural irregularities in his original trial. It appeared that technical issues might save his life, giving his defense team renewed hope for a different outcome. That hope proved premature. In 2007, a second Tulsa County jury reviewed the same evidence and testimony that had convinced their predecessors. Their verdict was identical: death. The presiding judge again agreed with the jury's recommendation, and Hanson found himself back on death row, his appeals options seemingly exhausted. Yet, a complex legal situation was developing that would delay his execution for nearly 2 decades. Hanson remained in federal custody in Louisiana, serving the life sentence plus 107 years he had received for his armed bank robbery convictions. This created an unusual jurisdictional challenge. Oklahoma held a death warrant for him, but the federal government maintained physical custody. For years, this arrangement continued without significant conflict. Hanson remained in Louisiana, while his various appeals worked their way through state and federal courts. But when Oklahoma scheduled his execution for December 15, 2022, an unprecedented political intervention occurred. The Biden administration, which had implemented a moratorium on federal executions and taken a strong public stance against capital punishment, made the extraordinary decision to refuse Hanson's transfer to Oklahoma. This effectively blocked his execution, creating a constitutional crisis that highlighted the deep philosophical divisions over capital punishment in contemporary America. For more than 2 years, Hanson remained in Louisiana while legal scholars and politicians debated the boundaries of federal authority versus state sovereignty. Oklahoma officials expressed outrage at what they viewed as federal overreach. Victims' families felt that justice was being denied. Meanwhile, Hanson sat in his federal cell, his execution indefinitely postponed by presidential policy. Political landscapes can shift rapidly, however. When Donald Trump assumed the presidency in January 2025, one of his first administrative actions was to reverse the previous administration's death penalty policies. Within days of the policy change, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond formally requested Hanson's transfer to state custody. On March 15, 2025, John Hanson finally arrived at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. After more than 20 years of legal maneuvering, he was where state officials had always intended him to be, on death row, awaiting the ultimate punishment. The final chapter of his legal battle began on May 7, 2025, when the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 to deny clemency. Hanson appeared before the board via video link, offering what many considered too little, too late. "I can't change the past. I would if I could." His attorneys mounted a final challenge to the clemency process itself. On June 9th, Oklahoma County District Judge Richard Ogden granted a temporary stay of execution pending resolution of their clemency dispute. Attorney General Drummond immediately appealed this decision. On June 11th, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the stay, clearing the path for execution. Hanson's legal team also claimed to have discovered new evidence of prosecutorial misconduct involving witness testimony, but the state's highest criminal court rejected these claims. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene on June 11. By Wednesday evening, all legal avenues had been exhausted. June 12, 2025. Oklahoma State Penitentiary, McAlester. John Hanson's final day began like every other day on death row, but everyone involved knew this day would conclude differently. Under Oklahoma's established protocol, condemned inmates are permitted to request a final meal within reasonable parameters. The details of Hanson's last meal request were not made public, following the state's recent policy of withholding such information to avoid sensationalizing executions. As the morning progressed, the administrative machinery of capital punishment moved forward with practiced efficiency. The execution chamber underwent final preparations. Designated witnesses took their assigned positions. Prison officials conducted their final protocol reviews. Outside the prison facility, members of the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty maintained a quiet vigil at the governor's mansion, standing in silent opposition to the proceedings about to unfold. At precisely 10 a.m. Central Time on June 12, 2025, John G. Fitzgerald Hanson was escorted into the execution chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The room maintained its deliberately clinical atmosphere, designed to carry out the state's ultimate sanction with whatever dignity such proceedings allow. Hanson was secured to the padded gurney, his arms positioned for the insertion of intravenous lines that would deliver Oklahoma's 3-drug lethal injection protocol. Behind reinforced glass panels, witnesses observed as the warden provided the final signal for the execution to commence. Oklahoma's current protocol employs a sedative to render the condemned unconscious, followed by paralytic and cardiac stopping agents. The process is engineered to appear peaceful, more resembling a medical procedure than an execution. Within 17 minutes, the man who had destroyed 2 innocent lives in 1999 was pronounced dead. For John Hanson, the long wait that had defined more than half his adult life was finally over. In the hours following the execution, Oklahoma and the broader nation reflected on the conclusion of a case that had encompassed multiple presidential administrations and raised fundamental questions about justice, federalism, and the role of capital punishment in American society. This execution marked Oklahoma's second of 2025, demonstrating the state's continued commitment to capital punishment under Governor Kevin Stitt's administration. The execution of John Hanson brings closure to a chapter that opened on that tragic August evening in 1999. However, it cannot resolve all the complex questions his case has raised throughout its quarter-century journey through the legal system. Was justice ultimately served? Should Victor Miller, who took Gerald Thurman's life, have received the same punishment as Hanson? Was the 2.5-decade delay between crime and punishment an example of justice delayed or justice denied? Should any presidential administration possess the authority to block a state execution through federal custody arrangements? These questions accompany every execution in America and contribute to making capital punishment one of our nation's most enduring and contentious debates. What remains indisputable is that 2 families suffered devastating losses in 1999, and their grief has persisted through more than 2 decades of legal proceedings. We can also affirm that the American justice system, despite its imperfections and delays, ultimately carried out the sentence imposed by 2 separate juries who heard the same evidence and reached the same conclusion. Whether this represents the fulfillment of justice or simply the conclusion of an extraordinarily long legal process is a determination each of us must make individually. The debate over capital punishment continues, but for the families of Mary Agnes Bowles and Gerald Max Thurman, a measure of closure has finally been achieved.